Colleagues, in respectful memory of the 321 people slaughtered in the appalling Easter Sunday terrorist attack in Sri Lanka, including 8 British citizens, and of the approximately 500 people wounded in those attacks, I propose that we now hold a 1-minute silence. Colleagues, thank you. Order. Statement the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, today the flags in Downing Street and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office are flying at half-mast following the horrific Easter Day terrorist attack in Sri Lanka. With your permission, I'd like to update the House on the attack and the UK government's response. On Sunday, multiple terrorist suicide bombings were conducted across Sri Lanka. 6 explosions occurred simultaneously, 3 in churches conducting Easter Day services in Colombo, Negombo and Batticaloa, and 3 more in hotels in Colombo, popular with foreign visitors. Information is still coming in, but we know that over 300 people have been killed. And we know that at least 8 of those, sadly, are British nationals. They include mother Anita Nicholson with her 14-year-old son Alex and 11-year-old daughter Annabelle, teenage brother and sister Amelie and Daniel Lindsay, retired firefighter Bill Harrop with his wife, retired GP Sally Bradley. The whole House will want to pass on our deepest sympathies and condolences as we digest a truly heartbreaking situation. I spoke to James Doris, the British High Commissioner in Colombo, earlier this afternoon, and want to put on record my thanks to him, his team and all the employees of the British Council for their dedication in extremely testing circumstances. One locally employed British Council employee is in hospital with his wife, both with serious injuries, and our thoughts are also with them and their family. Our travel advice has been updated and remains the best source of information for any British nationals or family members who have concerns about the situation. Yesterday I spoke to my counterpart, the Sri Lankan Foreign Minister, to express my thanks for the work of the emergency services in Sri Lanka, as well as pass on our condolences to all the bereaved families. I also discussed what further support the UK might be able to offer. Her Majesty the Queen, the Prince of Wales and other members of the royal family have sent messages of condolence to the President and people of Sri Lanka, and the Prime Minister is expected to speak with the Sri Lankan Prime Minister Wickrem Singh later today. Mr. Speaker, these attacks were a primitive and vile attempt to sow division between people of different faiths. Religious tensions have caused some of the bloodiest battles in human history, and it is sombre and sobering that even in the 21st century, attempts continue to set believers of different religions against each other. Our response must be to deny the perpetrators the satisfaction of dividing us by being united in our condemnation and united in our support for religious tolerance, surely one of humanity's greatest achievements. just as after the equally horrific attacks on the 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, we must respond by bringing people together, the exact opposite of what was intended by the perpetrators. It has to be said, the sheer brutality of these attacks was stark. One pair of attackers, after detonating their first explosives in a hotel, waited for people to try to escape before detonating a second device. The device destroyed by security services at Colombo Airport was most likely designed to target fleeing civilians. The attack was complex, tightly coordinated, and designed to cause maximum chaos, damage, and heartbreak. The UK will never stand by in the face of such evil. So today we stand in solidarity with the government and people of Sri Lanka, who have been making enormous strides towards stability and peace following the conclusion of the civil war almost exactly 10 years ago. The Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command has dispatched a team of specialists to Sri Lanka, including family liaison officers, to support and assist the families of British victims and the repatriation of deceased British nationals. A recent programme run by Interpol involved the training of 30 Sri Lankan forensic specialists and police officers by UK experts in disaster victim identification, which we also hope will be of additional support. The government of Sri Lanka has declared a state of emergency as the investigation continues. More than 20 arrests have been made, and there are likely to be more people involved in the planning of this attack who are still at large. Large amounts of IED materials have been recovered, including 87 low-explosive detonators recovered from a bus station. There are no verified claims of responsibility as yet. So far, 40 arrests have been made, and counter-terrorism activity continues. The Sri Lankan Prime Minister and President have both said publicly that there will be a thorough investigation into the incident and whether information was handled correctly, and it's important to let that process follow its course. Mr. Speaker, to attack Christian worshippers on Easter, a celebration of peace and the holiest day in the Christian calendar, betrays in these attackers an absence of the most basic values of humanity. Just 2 days ago, the Prime Minister and I both noted in our Easter messages of the dangers facing Christians around the world, 300 of whom are killed every month. In response to such acts, we must redouble our efforts to protect the freedom of religious minorities to practice their faiths wherever they are in the world. And for that reason, the FCO has asked the Bishop of Truro to do an independent report into what more can be done to protect persecuted Christians around the world. The British government will continue to give its wholehearted support to the people of Sri Lanka, and I'm sure the House will join me once again in expressing our deepest sadness and sympathy to everyone affected by these monstrous attacks, and I commend this statement to the House.
Lady Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement and for the tone of his words, with which I wholeheartedly agree. Let me join him in commending the work of the British High Commission in Colombo, who have once again demonstrated that in the very worst of circumstances of British nationals abroad, our consular services offer the very best of support. And I am sure that they will continue to ensure that the families of those British nationals who have so tragically been killed in these attacks will continue to get all the support they need at this time of unbearable shock and sadness. I have also full confidence in what the Foreign Secretary says when it comes to the assistance that this government is ready to offer to the Sri Lankan authorities, whether it's in relation to security and intelligence or with help for the forensic services, and he has our support and our thanks for that. I know that there are many questions to be asked about who was responsible for these attacks and what could have been done to prevent them, but today, frankly, is not a time for those questions. On this day of national mourning in Sri Lanka, as the first of those killed are buried and the death toll continues to mount, today is simply a time for this House and for this country to stand with the people of Sri Lanka and with those British families and those from around the world who have lost loved ones, and express our shared solidarity and grief at the devastation that they have suffered, and also to stand in admiration at the way the Sri Lankan people and their government have responded to this attempt to divide them by instead coming together in peace and calling for unity of all communities. And we in the West must do our part too to help Sri Lanka recover from this horror by continuing to visit that beautiful country and showing the terrorists that they will not win. But, Mr. Speaker, it is sadly apt that on St. George's Day, when we mark both the birth and the death of Shakespeare, we are confronted with this latest example of what he once called mountainous inhumanity. The unspeakable inhumanity and evil of men who would walk into a group of peaceful Christian worshippers at prayer, or happy foreign tourists having breakfast, and blow these innocent people up, killing at least 320, including 45 children, including an 8-year-old cousin of our good friend, the member for Hampstead and Kilburn. Dozens are still fighting for their lives in hospital, and hundreds more have received life-changing injuries. And when we ask how anyone's mind could become so warped and depraved and as to commit such an act, just as we did about the attack on Muslims in Christchurch last month, on Jews in Pittsburgh last October, we must not make the mistake of blaming religion, because there is no religion on this earth which teaches that the way to salvation is blowing up innocent children or shooting people at prayer. We must also not make the mistake of saying that one act of evil begets another, that somehow this atrocity happened because of the atrocity in Christchurch. I believe that that is an entirely false narrative and one that excuses terrorism, and we should never indulge it. Instead, we should call it out for what it is, an act born of pure, vicious, mind-polluting hatred, perpetuated by sickening, despicable individuals who don't worship God, they worship death, whose only religion is hate, and whose fellow believers in hatred and in death must be wiped from the face of our earth. But in these dark and terrible moments, I do see one shred of light and one piece of definite proof that the narrative which says that evil begets evil, that we reap what we sow, is indeed a false one. And that was the deeply moving statement made by Ben Nicholson, confirming the loss of his wife and his 2 daughters in the blast at Shangri-La Hotel. I do not think that there is any one of us who could understand what that grief would feel like. And we would all have understood if Mr. Nicholson's reaction had been one of anger and hatred towards the people who had destroyed his family. But instead, his response was filled with love. For his wife and his beautiful daughters, he rejected hatred, the hatred that had killed his family, and he responded to them with mountainous humanity. A humanity which no act of evil could corrupt, because, as Shakespeare also wrote, Mr. Speaker, unkindness may defeat my life, but never taint my love.
Can I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for not just the tone of her comments, but also the very moving way that she delivered them. And I want to thank her for her support for the work of the British High Commission, which is particularly challenging at this time. And we are indeed giving help to the Sri Lankan government. The 2 areas that they particularly requested help are in counter-terrorism work and countering violent extremism, of which we sadly have a lot of experience in this country as well. I think she's right to say that at times like this, bringing people together with a message of unity and reconciliation is the only approach. And I think people on all sides of this House were immensely inspired by the tone taken by the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern after the horrific attacks in Christchurch. And I know the Sri Lankan government is making every attempt to take the same approach. And I thank her for talking about the extraordinarily generous response that Ben Nicholson made after losing his wife and 2 children. And I also agree with her that these kind of attacks, far from being religious, are condemned by people of all faiths and none for their utter depravity. And the final point I wanted to make, was simply that whilst it is right that in this House we think about the 8 British people who lost their lives, the vast majority of people who were murdered were themselves Sri Lankans at church on Easter morning, celebrating the resurrection of Christ and life. They did not deserve to suffer this way, and it is absolutely right that we remember them as well.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend's statement, also for his raising the reality, which is clear to us all, that these attacks were planned to have the maximum effect on the single biggest day in a Christian calendar, when children are encouraged to be in the church celebrating what has been the resurrection for Christians of Christ. And therefore they would have known that the maximum effect would have been devastating. But does he agree with me also, and following the spokesman for the opposition, that the reality is that the one thing that Easter teaches us, it's about sacrifice for others, and that therefore forgiveness that follows. And I wonder if he will therefore ensure that no matter what else happens, we give our greatest support to the Sri Lankan government in pursuing those who have conducted this terrible attack, but at the same time recognising that the Christian faith is about forgiveness.
Well, I thank him for saying those brave words. It's very difficult, I think, for many people to think about forgiveness after what happened, but that is indeed an appropriate thing for Christians to think about, particularly at the time of Easter. But forgiveness doesn't mean the absence of justice, and that's why it is absolutely essential that we support the Sri Lankan authorities in their determination to track down everyone responsible. We know that they have identified other people who have not yet been arrested who they're looking for at the moment, and obviously for the safety and security of everyone in Sri Lanka, it's vital that they are found. But I thank him for the generosity of his comments.
Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and join him in thanking the High Commissioner, everybody at the High Commission in Colombo, and also the rest of the Foreign Office officials who must have worked in the most difficult and distressing circumstances over the weekend, and extend our thanks to the Sri Lankan emergency services as well for their efforts and work. At this time, our thoughts are obviously with all those who are affected, and condolences for the families who have had loved ones taken away in the cruelest of circumstances. That loss of life is always sad, but I have to say that I found it particularly heartbreaking in how many children were killed in this attack. And the brave and touching statement from Mr. Nicholson is something that is a lesson for each and every one of us. Mr. Speaker, savage acts of terrorism don't discriminate by age, but they also don't discriminate by faith either. And these attempts to sow division through violence at Easter of all times should be met with a response of peace and solidarity. Our message is that barbarism strengthens our belief in our common humanity, regardless of faith, background or ethnicity. And Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Foreign Secretary for the work that is ongoing with the Sri Lankan authorities. I'm glad to see that that assistance will be ongoing, but at the moment our prayers and our thoughts are with all those affected, and the message has to be from this place that hate and violence will not win out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I thank him for his comments, with which I wholeheartedly agree, and I think obviously the number of child victims of many, many nationalities is one of the most heartbreaking things to have occurred. I think also what this event reminds us is that when we talk about Christians suffering around the world, we're not talking about wealthy Westerners. We're talking about some of the poorest people in the world. It's only 8% of the population in Sri Lanka. And sometimes that fact has been obscured in terms of the priorities that we set ourselves as a country, and that's what we're hoping to put right with this review that's being done by the Bishop of Truro.
Alastair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank both the Foreign Secretary and the Right Honourable Lady for their tone and the statements they've made today, and through the Foreign Secretary and from experience express my thanks to Foreign Office and other UK government personnel who will be involved in dealing with the aftermath of the incident. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary particularly for expressing so clearly the indiscriminate nature of terrorist violence, and ask if he agrees with me that the best way to protect the Christian community or any community in the future is to ensure that the rule of law is everywhere, that the best of intelligence is shared around the world, and that an understanding that an attack on one is an attack on all becomes universal, for there is no hierarchy in terms of victimhood.
Well, those are the kind of wise words that I would expect from my right honourable friend with whom I was privileged to work for many years in the FCO. And I think he's right to say that if we're going to prevent this kind of horrific massacre happening in the future, there's really a combination of the hard and the soft. The hard side, of course, is making sure that the security is there, that the security services are able to do their job to track down perpetrators and potential perpetrators. But the soft side is what he and the Shadow Foreign Secretary so movingly talked about, which is the message of reconciliation. Because trying to set faith against faith is one of the oldest tricks in the book in human history. And it is a great measure of human progress that in the last 100 years we have massively increased across the world the amount of religious tolerance. But I'm afraid these events show that we can never be complacent.
Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his words, for his statement, and for all that his department is doing, and I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary also for her moving words. This was a heartbreaking attack on Sri Lanka, on Christians, and on peace-loving people everywhere, and we stand with Sri Lanka. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that we do face a real threat from those who seek to divide us, to drive our world towards conflict, where far-right nationalism and pseudo-religious extremism feed off each other in a dependent, destructive cycle, and we need to stand up and challenge that hate, and the best way to do that is to stand together with love?
Well, I do agree that is the fundamental challenge, and I think when you are trying to answer the important question as to how you prevent this kind of thing happening, the most important first step is to properly understand the motives of the people who try to perpetrate these attacks. And we don't know that at this stage, but it seems clear that one of them was a religious motive to try and set faith against faith, and one of them was a cultural motive to try and target Western tourists who are visiting Sri Lanka. And we have to be alive to both of those. But I think the Shadow Foreign Secretary was absolutely right in saying that one of the things that we can do to support Sri Lanka is obviously subject to travel advice, which is very carefully kept under review, to continue to visit a country that depends on tourism, to show our support and to show that we're not going to be put off by this kind of terrorism.
Sir Hugo Swire.
Whoever perpetrated these hideous crimes, whatever their warped ideology, are murderers, and cowardly murderers at that. And will my right honourable friend therefore convey to the High Commissioner James Doris' staff, and also to the government of President Sirisena and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, that we want to show our solidarity and sympathy with our Commonwealth cousins at this extraordinarily difficult time? Will he confirm, it may be too premature to do so, that many of those arrested to date appear to have connections of one sort or another with Syria? And if that is the case, would he look very carefully at extending whatever assistance he is giving to the government of Sri Lanka to offer similar assistance to the government of the neighbouring Maldives, where they also have a problem with returning foreign fighters from Syria, and where we have many British tourists on holiday at any given time of the year?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very important point, as I would expect as a former Minister of State for Asia at the FCO. And he's indeed right that there are some early indications of Islamist extremism that we need to investigate properly. The Maldives is a very young new democracy which we want to give every support that we can to, and so I'll take his point away.
Graham Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you will join me and other Right Honourable and Honourable members from all sides of the House in passing on our condolences to the previous member for Manchester Withington, Keith Bradley, now a member of the other place, whose sister, Dr. Sally Bradley, was killed in Sri Lanka. Her husband, Bill Harrop, was also killed in Sri Lanka. Dr. Sally Bradley qualified as a doctor at Manchester University. She'd worked as a GP in Salford. She'd been the Director of Public Health and the Director of Medicine in the Pennine Acute NHS Trust that covers a large part of Greater Manchester. Her husband, Bill Harrop, was a firefighter. He's not just a firefighter who'd worked in Manchester. He received a commendation after the 1976 IRA bomb, which went off in the centre of Manchester. There can, Mr. Speaker, be no distinction in people who are the victims of crimes like this, but there is something particularly monstrous and brutal when people who have dedicated themselves to public service are killed in this fashion. I spoke to Keith Bradley yesterday, and he told me that he was being supported by liaison officers, and he would want me to pass on his thanks to the Foreign Secretary. I would just finish, Mr. Speaker, by asking the Foreign Secretary, I'm sure I know his answer, but it is worth saying, that he will redouble the efforts to make sure people in this country and elsewhere are as safe as they possibly can be from the diaspora of ISIS in Syria and elsewhere.
Well, I thank him for reminding the House that in all these tragedies, behind all these tragedies are human beings, and for his very moving description of the wonderful public service of Bill Harrop and Sally Bradley, and I pass on my condolences to Keith Bradley and indeed to the Honourable Member for Hampstead and Kilburn, who also lost a relative in this attack. And I would just say that I was very privileged when I was Health Secretary to see firsthand the extraordinary work of the Greater Manchester Emergency Services in combating terrorism after the arena bombing. But I hadn't realised the connection that Bill Harrop had with fighting terrorism incidents in that city, and that makes it all the more moving.
Thank you. Mrs. Theresa Villiers.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to join others in expressing my horror and condemnation at the stomach-churning cruelty and appalling depravity of these attacks on innocent worshippers and tourists. And can I ask the Foreign Secretary, does he agree that it's vital that this appalling atrocity does not deter Sri Lankans in the efforts they've been making to press ahead with peace, reconciliation and accountability following the long years of conflict in that country?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for making that point. That, of course, is the bigger picture that, compared to 20 or 30 years ago, the extraordinary change in Sri Lanka now means that it's possible to visit all parts of the country, and they have really made incredible progress in tackling terrorism. That mustn't be obscured by this horrific incident, and she's absolutely right to say that.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we mourn all those who died in this Easter Sunday massacre, the Foreign Secretary will be aware that ISIS has sought to claim responsibility, saying that it had targeted nationals of the Crusader Alliance and Christians. If that proves to be the case, does that not show that although their forces may have been defeated on the battlefields of Iraq and Syria, their ideology has not been defeated? And does not that make it all the more important that on this day and every day in the future, that we stand shoulder to shoulder with all of those who stand for the right of all God's children to freely practice their religion in safety and peace in the face of such barbaric hatred.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman spoke incredibly powerfully, and I absolutely agree with him. Sadly, I doubt we will ever defeat the ideology of hatred because it's a persistent feature of human existence. But whichever guise that it emerges, we must be ready to stand up and fight it. And he's absolutely right that the territorial defeat of Daesh does not mean the ideological defeat of Daesh, and we must continue to redouble our efforts in precisely the way he says.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to listen to the statements by my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who have both spoken with great passion and integrity on the matter that concerns us all. And I can't have been alone this weekend in holding my own children that much closer after reading Ben Nicholson's heartbreaking words and hearing his enormous courage. But this really does offer a challenge to us here in this House, as so much of our debate in the last year or two has been inward-looking. That we must look outwards and not just support the people of Sri Lanka at this incredibly difficult time, but could my right honourable friend perhaps confirm that he will also be redoubling efforts elsewhere and in supporting Christian communities around the world, and on the advice of the Bishop of Truro, he'll also be looking to support other communities threatened by terrorism. And while in some ways we may not be world leaders in every field, there are a few in which we really are, and intelligence, diplomatic support, and indeed training to important allies and partners is one area where we really can make a difference in these fields. So while I welcome the work of the Metropolitan Police and their units who have already deployed, there is so much that I know he cannot talk about, but at least it would be good to know that is going to the support of our friends and allies around the world.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and I think he subtly alluded to the challenge we face at the moment with the big issue that we are preoccupied with in this House, that we should not forget that the rest of the world looks to this country to show leadership in tackling these very big issues and wants us to get back on the job as quickly as possible. And when it comes to freedom of religious belief, I think it's very important that we remember that it isn't just terrorism that is the issue. There is state-sponsored oppression in many countries of people who just wish to practice their faith freely. And that's why the work that we are doing will not just look at what we can do to prevent terrorist incidents of this kind, but also how we can use diplomatic levers to stand up for the rights of people all over the world to do just as we are able to do in this country, which is to practice our religion freely.
Yvette Cooper.
Can I thank the Foreign Secretary and Shadow Foreign Secretary for their moving words, because the events and the stories coming out of Sri Lanka are truly heartbreaking, and we know that to attack churches on Easter Sunday, the streets and hotels in this way is truly vile. They are right that the extremists and terrorists are seeking to divide us, and it is so important to bring people together. Can I therefore also ask him, doesn't this show also the importance of the international partnerships that we have on intelligence and security, being able to use those as well in support of Sri Lanka and other countries in the international fight against ISIS and extremism, and that their work is about supporting peace and saving lives?
Yeah. This is, of course, something she would understand very well from her former role as Shadow Home Secretary, and she is absolutely right. And we, in this country, are lucky to have superb intelligence services, and we have very strong intelligence relationships all over the world, and we need those relationships to keep each other secure. So I can absolutely give her the assurance that even though these things happen under the surface, they are a very, very important part of our counter-terrorism effort.
Ranil Jayawardena.
Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. And this is so sad for Sri Lanka. It takes us back to the dark old days that my right honourable friend has spoken about. And these are such cold, calculated attacks that it really does make us all think about the character, the thought process of those involved, or dare I say, the lack of thought at all. And to attack Christians, as has been said on Easter Sunday, is nothing short of barbaric. So I'm grateful for what my right honourable friend has said, in that Britain will never stand by, and Britain has already committed resources to support the Sri Lankan government. But can he go further and set out that Britain, of course, will provide support not only to Sri Lanka but others in tackling this global threat? It appears that ISIS has influenced and integrated into domestic organisations in Sri Lanka, without which these organisations would not have been able to cause such devastation. And will he also commit and confirm to the House that this really strengthens his resolve, which I know is a personal mission of his, to make sure that we are tackling the persecution of Christians around the world, because that is something that too often goes unreported.
Well, I'm certainly happy to give him my personal commitment that I want to do more on this front, and also to tell him that the UK is a world leader in countering extremist disinformation online. It's something we've developed particular expertise on over the last 5 years or so, and we do share that information widely. The other point I just wanted to make is that he's absolutely right to say how coldly calculated this attack was. To have 6 explosions to be coordinated to go off at virtually the same moment requires an enormous degree of planning. And so they knew exactly what they were doing. They spent a long time planning it, finding the recruits to do it. And we have to just think hard about the kind of people that would do that. And I hope that means that we redouble our efforts to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also join the Foreign Secretary and the Shadow Foreign Secretary and colleagues across the House in my utter condemnation of these terrorist attacks? My thoughts are with the victims and their families. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the focus on protecting religious minorities, in this case Christian minorities, has to be redoubled, because the atmosphere of intolerance towards religious minorities, whether they're Christian or Buddhist or Muslims or Jews or Hindus, when they are minorities in different countries, has increased, and the international community has got to step up at the international level to provide that protection as well as security to minorities.
Well, she is absolutely right, and I commend her for the work that she's done championing the rights of Rohingya Muslims in Burma, which was, I think, the first contact that I had with her when I became Foreign Secretary. And I think it's very important to understand that it's a kind of easy first thing to attack, to target someone because of their religion, and in very poor countries, where there are a lot of people who haven't had proper education, it's easy to whip up feelings in a way that can be absolutely lethal. So I wholly agree with what she says.
Mr. Stephen Crabb.